Good morning to you all. Thank you so much for partaking in our discussion today. My name is Katlego Ramantsima, and I am from the Institute for Land and Agrarian Studies based at the University of the Western Cape. Today we will be discussing this brilliant and timely book titled Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. I say that it's timely because there has been a lot of developments following the December 7th failure of the ANC to amend the Constitution. And there's been the buzz around, expropriation without compensation, what the bill would entail, and so forth. And in and around the city of Cape Town, we've also seen how land occupations have been taking place, and also the law seemingly working against those who are poor to access land in the city-urban area. Today I am joined on stage by Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is an advocate in the High Court specializing in public law, and also the author of The Land is Ours, and this current book that we will be talking about, Land Matters. We are also joined by Mpho, Raboeane, who is an attorney at Ndifunukwazi's Law Center, specializing in constitutional law and human rights litigation. And also on my far left, we are joined by Andries du Toit, who is a fellow researcher and a director at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. So this is how the conversation will work. We will start off by having a discussion amongst ourselves where I will pose questions, and then we will give it up to the floor for more questions regarding the book and any other land matters that are of your concern. Firstly, Tembeka, I would like to congratulate you on this wonderful publication on land matters. I think your book actually gives us deep insights as to where we come from, where we're currently at, and also where are we heading to as a country with regards to issues regarding land matters. But also it's about the central importance of the Constitution for transformation in South Africa. But first, I think the audience and myself would want to also understand, how does this particular book link with your first book titled The Land is Ours, South Africa's First Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism? And also, as a practicing lawyer, how do you see your work contributing to the transformation of South Africa?
Well, I'm not sure about the second question, if my work is contributing at all. I think a lot of people would say it's not. Anyway. But on the first question about the connections, the first book was about land. It's got a chapter there that says how the land was lost. I suppose even this still has a lot of flavor from that first book. But it was also about people. I was trying to trace the forgotten stories of black lawyers in South Africa. So this book does not have that section. It's missing completely. But it was also, thirdly, about the origins of constitutionalism. So I'm not discussing here the origins of constitutionalism, but I'm discussing the future of constitutionalism in relation to how it can guarantee a future for all South Africans. But it will also guarantee a future that's much more equitable than the past where we come from. So the central theme, I was telling Andres before we started that I was at the University of Free State a couple of weeks ago discussing the book with a very anxious audience. And the theme really is, first, to just speak the truth about the past. There is a lot of denial and obfuscation and evasion about what actually happened. And so as to expand the scope of what the undertaking is for the rectification of that past. And then the second one is to center the future on a constitutional framework. And so it's a relevant thing these days. I mean, look, the book contains at least 3 chapters that criticize the attempted constitutional amendment. I don't want to say I won, but it looks like I did. But I think everyone has come around their senses, to accept that the future lies is embedded in the framework of the Constitution. So although it starts with a very painful discussion, it ends on a hopeful note, I think, in my own, although there are people that will still dispute whether or not that note is a hopeful one. And then what I also do is to discuss the constraints of the transition, which is something we usually overlook in talking about land, that the constraints in Section 25 of the Constitution are a reflection of the socio-political constraints of the transition itself. So I do ask us to go back to the transition and look at the pitfalls of that transition and what we could have done. But I still come to the conclusion, even after I've analyzed those pitfalls, I still come to the conclusion that Section 25, in fact, is the mandate for transformation. And what we are supposed to be doing is expanding its operation and testing its limits in order to push for a sustainable future for all. And I mean, I've got parts there where I deal with Zimbabwe and Namibia and the pitfalls in those countries. And I come to the conclusion that the Namibian problem was less of a Zimbabwean problem was less of a land problem than a rule of law problem. And I explore the similarities with Namibia. And even there, I say that that country is headed to a catastrophe if it abandons the rule of law. So yeah, my work as a lawyer, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm not particularly proud of some of the things I do as a lawyer, but sometimes I get people in prison. But I also still spend a lot of time working on concerns of poor people and trying to use the Constitution to advance their position, and sometimes not with a lot of success. But I think I'm sort of contributing in a modest way towards advancing transformation in South Africa. So I supplement my limitations as a lawyer with my work as a writer.
Yeah. Awesome. I will now move on to you, Andries. You have written a very critical yet important review of this book, where you've argued that the book basically is not merely about, the big debates that we've been talking about, expropriation without compensation, but there is more to this land debate and we need more work. But in the interest of those who have maybe not come across your review, can you share more on your thoughts on the book?
Thank you, Katlego. Yes, I was very excited to be sharing the stage with Tembeka here, partly because I think Tembeka's book helps us to have conversations about land reform that go beyond this red herring issue of expropriation without compensation, which is really not what we need to be talking about when we need to be talking about land reform. What we need to talk about when we talk about land reform is the real politics of land and real transformation in this country, for which we have the legal and political instruments in our hands, if we want to use them. On the one hand, what I saw Tembeka doing in the book is really an impassioned argument for a more radical, pro-poor interpretation of what land reform should be about. The land reform program we have at the moment is land reform for the 1%. It's actually land reform for the 0.0001%. That is what our current Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform is trying to do. At most 10,000 black capitalist farmers will benefit. land reform should be for the many, land reform should be for the poor. And land reform for the poor is eminently possible because it will involve releasing land for poor people where they are, where they need it to be. And incidentally, the most important and the most urgent calls for land at the moment in South Africa is not on the farmlands, is not in the rural areas, it's in the urban areas. And that's why I'm very excited to hear what Mpho is going to be saying. But the other thing that you do in your book that I thought is so powerful is that the book is an argument for constitutionalism. It is an argument that we need a constitution. And I think that's really important because in a way, that is what all of this heat and light has been about, is about the legitimacy of this constitution. If you try to understand why the thing is, on the one hand, land is a material reality. It's necessary for agriculture, it's necessary for people to live. Sometimes banks like to have property for collateral for loans, but most people in the country need it simply because they need it to make their livelihoods, they need a place to stay. So land matters as a material reality, but land is also a symbol, and an extremely charged symbol. It's a symbol of the violence of the past, it's a symbol of the unfairness and the injustice of the present. And that's really the angle that Julius Malema and Andries du Toit and co have been milking. They use the land question to put into place the national question. They're not saying who should use this piece of land for what. They're saying, whose country is this? Umhlaba. Whose land is this? Whose country is this? Who belongs here? Now we have a working answer to that, which is South Africa belongs to all who live in it. That's what it says in the preamble to the Constitution. But the Constitution, and I don't know whether you agree with me, Tembeka, the Constitution is therefore based on a scandalous and obscene proposition, which is that the ancestors, the descendants, the children of the people who stole the land shall live in peace and friendship and in relation of juridical equality and moral equality with the people from whom the land was stolen. And that's the question that Julius Malema is asking us. Are you willing to accept that? And I think it's a good question. I think it's a question that we can't look away from. And my answer is yes, we should accept that, but then we have to earn it. And that really brings us back to the question of how do we live with this Constitution? How do we implement it? How do we make the Constitution a real document that brings real citizenship, not second-class citizenship to people? And I think, and I'm going to stop ranting now, I think one of the things is we have too much thought about land simply as an economic issue. Land is a factor of production. Land is a certain kind of economic value. But land is the ground of belonging. It is because people do not have a place to stay or belong that they feel like second-class citizens. When you take somebody's land, when you deny somebody security of tenure, you're saying you're not a real citizen of this country. And that is how we get to land occupations, how we get to land evictions, how we get to J.P. Smith's cops shooting a street person who was just making a fire. And that's why I think approaching land as a ground of belonging, saying give people land so that they can belong, so that they can feel they belong in this country, so that they can be real citizens. Give them land now. Give them land in well-situated areas close to the city center. That is what we need to do, and we can do it. It's not impossible. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there.
No worries. And then I just wanted to ask Ngcukaitobi to also respond to the question that you posed around your arguments around the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, it's the heart of the book. It's constitutionalism. The framing of it is land. So it's balancing the symbolic significance of land and its economic importance. In fact, I do ask the question, I can't remember which chapter. She would. Look at all of the flags. There is a sentence in the book that says, the Constitution says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And then the following one is, does in fact South Africa belong to all who live in it? In the light of the disparities in wealth and in the light of the disparities in land allocation. So unless we address this problem of land, we are not going to address the larger national problem about the ownership of the country. But my argument is a historical one about the forms and uses of constitutionalism. So we have a constitution that's written in blood, that's born in a revolution, born in war. And its primary function is the restoration of citizenship. Primarily, it is about citizenship. This country is a new country. This is a 1909 creation. It is a new country. And its primary foundation is the denial of citizenship and the historical sin that the Constitution intended to resolve is citizenship. So land is then a vehicle or a symbol of citizenship. So unless the Constitution is, as I say somewhere in the book, taken off the shelves, dusted off, and put on the land to work, we are not going to resolve the problem of citizenship. Now, why this is an important discussion for South Africa is that in the last, I would say, probably four years, and I won't criticize the EFF for its use of this debate. I'll talk about the ANC because it has real political power. The ANC has asked people in South Africa, millions, do you want land? It's been running a referendum asking people if they want land. Now, it is a negation of its founding principle. The ANC is a 1912 organization. The reason it was formed is because there was a discussion about the Native Land Act. It was formed in order to resist the idea of taking away the land of native people. So to be asking us in 2022 if black people need land is a negation of its reason for existence. So which means there's another discussion taking place, which is in the light of the failure of a catastrophic failure of the last 25 years, the ANC has now manufactured a new enemy, the Constitution. So if we want to reclaim the soul of the country, we need to speak in favor of the Constitution, explicitly in favor of the Constitution. But as the book towards the end asks the question, what form of the Constitution do we have in mind? In other words, what is the version of this Constitution? Because we've got to accept that it is a very contested piece of paper, right? It's almost a blank canvas. And the contestation is what should be written into this blank canvas. So, and I ask for a radical, left-leaning, progressive, and expansive interpretation of this Constitution in order to make sense of the citizenship question.
Thank you so much. We now move on to Mpho. Mpho is going to give us an urban perspective, of which I think that whenever we talk about land issues, we tend to think of, agrarian land or productive land in the rural context. But there has been a real urgency for access to land in the urban city area, and somehow there seems to be like a pushback from the city to get those who are urban poor out. Can you take us through what has been happening and how do you assess all these developments?
Sure, thank you. So you're right in saying that there is a huge urgency around accessing urban land. And one of the major things that we've come to grapple with is how historical uses of land mixed with market forces effectively entrench the exclusivity that poor and black people are experiencing, especially in terms of accessing well-located land. Now, The experience on the ground, unfortunately, is a far cry from the aspirations of the Constitution. A disappointing thing is that when people on the ground try to actualize the Constitution themselves in terms of realizing and implementing the promise of Section 25.5, for instance, they are met with the full might of the law, number one, as well as all the political machinations and armory behind the use of that law. So what we've been seeing in the context of the city of Cape Town, for instance, we know that COVID-19 all over the country has laid bare the inequalities of the country. But here in Cape Town, COVID-19 has shown us how anti-poor people in power actually are, and how the commitment to the Constitution is absent in places of power. If you look at the occupations that have sprung up during COVID-19, you'll know that security of tenure, which is closely tied to this thing of the land question and citizenry, where security of tenure has been precarious for poor and black people for a long time. When COVID hit, people frankly had no safety net. They had nowhere to go. And because of the economic factors at play as well, people had no alternative but to self-solution by putting occupations up in all vacant land. Now, in terms of the law, occupying vacant land without the consent of the owner is not necessarily a criminal act. It's unlawful in as far as there's no consent and all of that, but it's not a criminal act. In fact, the criminality of squatting, as it used to be called, was actually taken away when old type legislation, apartheid era legislation, was repealed to make way for PI. But what we are seeing now is the resurrection of that apartheid type legislation that criminalizes the act of occupying vacant land. And that criminalization goes further to actually criminalize being poor. Because if you look at the reasons why people occupy land, it's out of a desperate need to be somewhere. So as people, as Africans, I think one of the primary things that we need to realize as we talk about this thing about the land is Africans identify with land not only as a resource, as we've been saying. Yes, it's identity, but it's also spiritual. And in a sense, if you can't put your feet on the ground somewhere, you are not grounded as a person and you are not grounded spiritually. And I think that's the effect that we've been seeing. That's the long-standing effect of colonialism and apartheid, to not only take away the land from the people, but take the soul from the people as well, so that there's no will to fight, there's no will to assert themselves as citizens of this country, which then brings us back to this question of who belongs. And the act of criminalizing poor people who are just trying to assert the promises of the Constitution shows us that the poor, black people, specifically in the city of Cape Town, do not belong. That is essentially what we're seeing. So if we think about urban land reform, yes, generally it's been neglected as a concept with all this focus on agrarian land reform. But if you look at the number of people who are actually moving or migrating to urban centers, the numbers of the population that are in and around urban centers, the reform question really needs to be centralized on the urban aspect of it. And one of the key things there is to grapple with this question of redistribution, because we know that there hasn't been a real political will to deal with urban land reform. Firstly, because it's so intrinsically or intimately tied with the workings of the economy. There's a lot of urban wealth tied to real estate. And that is a key consideration for people in power who have to navigate their relationships with people who hold real power and control the political agenda and fund the political agenda versus the people who depend or rely on these people that we've put into power to give services and access, etc., etc. So there's a lot that we need to unravel when we're looking at urban land and who gets to access urban land and who is at the heart of controlling and developing and benefiting from urban land. And I would say it's certainly not the people who work in those urban centers, and it's certainly not the people who actually need to benefit from those urban centers.
Thank you so much, Mpho. You've touched, on a very important issue regarding tenure reform, which I also feel like it's been, excluded from this whole debate a lot, especially when it comes to issues in the rural context. I mean, like recently there has been, the issue of the Ingwenyama Trust declaring that they are, the rightful custodians and owners of that land. And then there has also been a pushback also from those on the ground who are saying basically that they want land. They were making land demands and they actually want to control the land as a resource themselves. So I just want to hear from you, Tembeka, how do we balance these struggles? Because it seems to me that similar struggles are happening in the urban context and even in the rural context. So how do we detangle all of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are two dynamics that are crucial on this debate. The first is the World Bank published a report in 2018 in which it said that since 1994 up to the time the report was being prepared, 2016, 2017, 2018, South Africa had witnessed a 61% rural-urban migration. So the villages are being deserted at an astonishing and a rapid pace. But notwithstanding that, the statistics, I think, published by PLAAS, your own institution, are that there are about 20 to 22 million Africans that live in customary tenure systems. So that's more or less 40% of the population. That's a lot of people who live in rural areas. So those people live in a land tenure system that is archaic, largely reflective of the colonial myth around land ownership. And basically the way that system developed is that the British come into this country, they meet a lot of native people. They decide we cannot control all of them because there are too many of them, there are very few of us. So they design a system of indirect control, and the system of indirect control works by the appointment of native chiefs in order to look after large scores of these people. This is then developed in the late 1870s as the Shepstone system. And the Shepstone system is about native locations. So you appoint a chief, and the chief becomes responsible for a particular tribe. And the powers of the chief in customary systems did not include the control of the land. The powers of the chiefs were political or cultural. But the British included in the assignment of the powers of the chiefs control over the land, which meant the control over the politics and the economic production in those areas, which could give control to the Governor General, who was an appointee of the British. Now that system over time has sort of morphed into Zulu customary law, Xhosa customary law, Tsonga customary law, all of these customary systems, and they've become accepted by all of us. Even though they were founded in a distortion, they've become accepted as custom. They are still largely reflected today. And one of the elements there was taking away control by women over land, so that women are sort of perpetual minors when it comes to their relationship with the krolheads, their relationship with the chiefs, etc. So fast forward to 2021, 2022, the real situation you find if you go to Zululand, specifically in the area of Ingwenyama, you'll find a woman asking for allocation of land from Induna, and the Induna would refuse on the basis that she's a woman, and if they want allocation, they should bring a male. And the poor woman says, well, my husband is dead. And then they say, well, bring your uncle. Well, I don't have uncles. Well, bring your son then. Any male. So that's all distorted as custom. And it's been a system of emasculation of real power from below. The reforms that are needed there is the restoration of the true customary system, which is power from below and controlling the land. But that is facing a real challenge from chiefs who are using custom, but it's a distorted version of custom. But these chiefs are a very powerful lobby, and they have been able to lobby the politicians in order to frustrate reforms and to initiate reforms that concentrate power at the top. And that's one of the points I try to debate, that if we are serious about land reform in the context of the traditional communities, we first need to reform custom itself, and so that we can restore the authority over the land to the people. In other words, the people themselves should control the land and not the chiefs. That's obviously made me very unpopular in certain areas where I've repeated the message, including in Zululand itself, where I made a big mistake of saying the thing I'm saying here.
Okay, thank you so much, Ngcukaitobi. With regards to this, urban and rural divide, and this question is for you, Andries. How do we get beyond this urban and rural divide that has been happening? Because even in policy and practice, we've seen the state, regarding land reform as a program specifically for those who are, in the rural context. But here, as we hear from Mpho, there's a burning need, for accessing land. How do we overcome that?
Thank you, Katlego. I think it's been very interesting in the last while. PLAAS, as you can hear by the name, has kind of got its head in the rural space. And we've been learning from Difuna Ikwazi and Seri and other organizations. In a new way, it's been inspiring and exciting, but also a bit depressing. I said to Adi Kumar, your director the other day, that the difference between rural and urban land struggle seems to be that in the rural areas, government takes the attitude that poor people are somebody else's problem, the chief's problem. Whereas in the urban areas, government takes the attitude that poor people are the enemy. And there are many ways around it, and I think the reforms that Tembeka is talking about and the processes of contesting eviction and action that Mpho is talking about are some of the ways in which you can question that. But I've been listening to us talk, and I'm struck by the danger of getting into an extremely pessimistic, kind of defeatist almost frame, where it's the poor people who are the victims of the ANC and the chiefs on the one hand, and the marginalized poor people of the urban areas on the other. And I think it is, if we want to get real about land reform, we need to start thinking about what are the positive actions that we want to take, and what are the positive, exciting, inspiring visions that we want to hold forward. Because in a way, and I'm going to become a bit academic, what we're talking about here is hegemony. We're talking about the fact that the field of the possible has been colonized by a particular way of looking at things, which is not so much I think in a way, although the DA has lost the political battle, they have won the policy battle, because we keep thinking in these neoliberal frameworks where we are boxed into particular ways of thinking about land and as a resource, as if the future is simply made by ratepayers and banks and landowners. And I think we can think about other ways of thinking about rural space, thinking about different landscapes in where people belong, and we can imagine other ways of living in urban space, because it's not only the ratepayers who should be part of this discussion. And I just want to throw it over to think about the costs and benefits, for example, in the urban things. It's, yes, the landowners, and I'm one of them, stand to lose if there are more, if something will happen to property values, I'm told, if there are more poor people in the city. But we must not think about land in such a siloed way, because land issue in Cape Town is not only about belonging, it's also about transport. I mean, this week we had a crippling taxi strike in the city, which would have been impossible if Cape Town had not been an apartheid city to begin with. And if we didn't have a situation where the poorest people in the city are the furthest away from where their jobs are. We have created a city where the poorest people in this town live in Nkanini, which is, if they were any further from Cape Town City, they'd be in the sea. 40 rand or something like that to simply make it to the city town. So reimagining the city, reimagining it as an inclusive city, also means reimagining it as a more human, more connected, cheaper, more humane city. That's the kind of city that I want to be in. I don't want to live in these little white enclaves. And I think that we as people thinking about land struggles, we get so hooked up on pointing everything that's going wrong and everything that's wrong with the current situation. What I think we need to do is to hold forward these inspiring, positive issues of different ways of belonging in rural and urban land and practical programs of action that can take us there. And that's why I think we're very excited to be sitting on this stage, because Difune Kwazi has been doing quite a lot of really exciting work. And just for example, I don't know whether you can talk about the hospital occupation, just about a different way of inhabiting urban space and making it real and showing that a different future is possible.
Thanks, Andries. In the little time that we have, I want to pose this question to Mpho, and just know that what do we do now that the constitutional amendment has failed?
What do we do now? So now that the constitutional amendment has failed, like Tembeka advocates, yes, it's time to dust off the Constitution as is and realize the aspirational potential of that document. But my question to that is that enough? Is the Constitution enough? And if we think about that, bringing it down to real-world examples, like Andries is saying, if we want to reimagine this whole debate around land and belonging and access to land, one of the central things we have to face and hopefully get away from is this marriage to private property. It's private property and private property interests that help to maintain the exclusion experienced by those who are at most need in terms of accessing land. And it's private property interests that most of the time are the blockages to the more imaginative, alternative ways of being and occupying. So looking at the occupations, for example, Andries is now provoking me to take you through what's happening there.
Yeah.
And I think that's an illustration of real people power, in the sense that there is no state-centric reliance on, I guess, governmental assistance, and there's no state-centric reading and interpretation of the Constitution in as far as accessing land and creating their own adequate housing. What's happening with Woodstock, as well as in Sea Point, opposite the waterfront, people who were facing displacement due to gentrification and other market interests, including your property rates. People who have been living in Cape Town, in the well-situated areas of Cape Town for all their lives, suddenly found themselves unable to keep up with the economic demands of private property interests and found themselves in a situation of financialization of real estate becoming a reality, pushing them out of what they traditionally would call home. And as a response to that, instead of taking up the offer by the city to be transported even further than that 40 kilometers away, where there is absolutely no development, no social cohesion, nothing to sustain a community, they decided that rather we stay in the areas that we've always lived in, maintain our sense of identity as well as dignity, and create for ourselves the society that we would want to see. So for them, they are creating they are forcing inclusivity in the city by occupying these spaces. They are actually an expression of the city that Andries would like to see. But unfortunately, those expressions are routinely crushed by people who want to maintain the status quo. So the blinkers that we have on with respect to how we see property, private property, and the economic ramifications of owning property, that has been a sledgehammer in terms of the imagining of the alternative. Currently now, that very hospital occupation in Woodstock is facing an eviction from the city. And this is in spite of deliberations and efforts in conjunction with some of the city officials themselves to reimagine the site so that it could be more habitable for more people and sustainable as a recognized space of affordable housing. And that, we could argue, is a type of urban land reform. That, we can argue, is a type of reimagined tenure system that we want to debate about, but when it is actually happening in the real world, it's the very laws that we subscribe to, and it's the very people in power who are entrusted with maintaining and enforcing those laws that come up against realizing those aspirations. So I think what we need to do here, but also in other spaces, is really think about our relationship with private property and really think about whether or not the Constitution in and of itself will get us to a place where people like those in the occupations can continue to exist as part of the society.
Thanks, Mpho. I'm really tempted to ask more questions, but looking at the time, I will now offer, the opportunity to the audience to ask any of our panelists a question. Yes?
Thanks. Ngosikona from Khayelitsha. I'm inspired by the work that the three panelists are doing and very much motivated. Where I'm stuck, ilanteta isixhosa iti sisengela thungendlini. We're milking to the same basket or bucket that will hold the milk. But which basket will hold, or which bucket will hold this land and distribute it in a manner that's not discriminating against women, that's not discriminating against poor people in society. You have mentioned, Comrade Tembeka, that agricultural land is in the hands of the ANC comrades. All NEC members have got farms somewhere. The rural land is in the hands of Ingonyama Trust and other trusts similar to that in the Eastern Cape. We know that urban land is used as the current currency in the city of Cape Town. Land is being undervalued and given to private developers by the DA government. And so if we're fighting for this land, who's going to hold it for us and distribute it in a manner that's not discriminating against people on the basis of poverty, on the basis of race, but also on the basis of one just being a woman, that it's not only in the context of rural areas, but also in the urban areas as well. In the informal settlements, it's hard to find, leaders in these communities giving land, access to land to women as well. That's where I'm stuck, and that's my question. Leli Peltunga that will hold, El Packet that will hold this milk that we're milking this land to. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's a very good question. Let me attempt an answer. What I try to show in my book, and that's certainly been my experience, land reform is strangulated at various levels. So Mpho's hypothesis that the private property paradigm is itself a constraint on land reform is one of the arguments I try to make. Yet, the Constitution itself doesn't guarantee private property. This was a big struggle at the adoption of the Constitution about private property. So that too is a constitutional question. There is no private property in the Constitution. It was expressly not included after a protracted struggle for the protection of private property by people like Sheila Kamera, who was the spokesperson of the National Party during the multi-party negotiations after 1994 to 1996. Despite the fact that the Constitution does not aspire towards private property, what it aspires towards is secure tenure, which is a much more expansive notion of living on the land. The ANC government, since 1997, has pursued the private property regime as the holy grail of land reform. And now that's what needs to be confronted. Every policy that the ANC has passed since its white paper on land reform in 1997 has been in pursuit of private property. Yet private property places a stranglehold on proper, genuine land reform. So it's time to put on the agenda this adherence to private property as an idea. And the second point that you raise is the role of the state. This last 4 years has also introduced the idea of state custodianship over the land. Now, I've been very critical of state custodianship because it's the concentration of power on politicians, again, in a population that is emerging from 25 years of state corruption and another 40 years of the National Party corruption, notwithstanding the other 300 years of the British and the Dutch corruption. So what we cannot afford as citizens is another version of the concentration of political power through the land on politicians. Despite that, land reform is constrained by the power that private property landowners hold over it. The entire value chain of land reform is controlled by landowners. They decide which land will be made available. They decide the price for the land. They even decide the beneficiaries for the land. And the state and the landless are spectators. So the reform is in the structure of the system. And the structure of the system placing the state not as a holder of the land, but as a facilitator of land reform that is genuinely and based on the interests of poor people. At the moment, the institutions of state land reform are very weak. They have been collapsing. When we had the first Land Reform Commission in 1994 to 1999, these were strong researchers. If you look now at those offices, the offices are empty. They've been gutted of talent. So unless you reinstitute the talent in those institutions, you have a revolution that is going nowhere. And these are practical questions about who is going to be making the decision. When the application form comes in through the email, it's no longer the fax machine, but through the email, who is going to open it? And are they going to be able to read the map or not? Because that's the level of granular detail that is strangulating land reform. The institutions are dying. So I'm asking for the reinstitution of these institutions for land reform as the key towards this revolution we have.
Thank you. Any other question?
Good morning. I'm Bebel Lucas. I'm one of the leaders living in the occupation in Woodstock. Just to share more than just a question, the politics that we're dealing with comes from directly the sunset clauses of Joe Schlobo and his associates. Land reform, the manner in which it has been constrained and constituted within the ANC, is never going to be a pathway for the people to access land. Whilst never referring to private property, it had always taken a stance in defense of private property. And that is the big challenge for us as the social movements, how to shift the balance of forces within the liberation movement. And for me, having lived for the past 5 years in the occupation, it becomes very clear that the defense of our occupation of land and of property by the people is the way to go. We have formulated alternative proposals that we have drawn up together with the people living in the occupation. And that is going to be our way of responding to the manner in which this particular Democratic Party rules the city. And the point being made as to the control and power that is being wielded by private property is something that social movements need to unpack and formulate a response. The labor movement from 1973, when black workers independently started to organize themselves, it took them 20-odd years to get to the formation of COSATU, to get to the formation of COSATU. And sadly, it's no secret the demise of what has happened to the labor movement. But there are lessons to be learned of how, through years of struggle, and not to accept the kind of narrative that is being forced upon us, but to find creative ways to resist and to rewrite the narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take the hand at the back, please?
Hi, I'm Nelly. Couple of questions going around in my head, okay? One of them is around the question of land, I think particularly towards Mpho, in urban centers, right? And what you're talking about in terms of like what's happening in Arbs down to Sea Point, right? In terms of like all the squattering that's happening, right? And I wonder whether or not there's a bigger issue with the commodification of life in general, more than there's an issue of whether or not there is land or even housing in urban centers, right? Because if you're imagining what's happening in Oz in terms of like the rental property, right? A lot of the accommodation is empty, right? A lot of the houses are empty, right? There's a lot of buildings that are going on auction at the moment, right? There's a lot of to-let signs for businesses as well that's going on, right? And this is pre-COVID. Like, this is pre-COVID vibes. So is there a question on land? Is there a question around availability of land or even housing? If there are so many vacant spaces that are not being filled? Or is the question more around the commodification of life, right? And if we're going to talk about the commodification of life, then what I'm interested in is thinking about how there's also like a falsified sense of hope that is driven around the idea of urban centers, right? Because some of these people actually have houses. Now, I'm not one of those people who are going to think that the village is something that is dying. I certainly don't. COVID-19 is something, COVID-19 actually has shown us how it's not and how a lot more people are moving back to the village. I mean, the interaction with some of our foreign nationals have also allowed us as Black South Africans to understand the value of village land or rural land. So I'm not one of those kind of people. But what I'm interested in finding out is like, why would people, if the issue is land and people have houses, why are they choosing to live in a shack outside Arbs, aspiring for a job that obviously they don't have because those people are there throughout the day? It's not like they leave and the place suddenly becomes vacant and then, you know, the whole day. So that's one of my thinkings. The other thinking is this question around reform, right? That we speak about.
Can you like quickly keep it short,
Okay.
just in the interest of time.
Okay,
The
cool.
second question.
But the question around reform for me is thinking about like, it's such a difficult question because we talk about reform and we're thinking about you're talking about how in KZN women are treated in this ways and whatnot, but maybe the thinking should not be around reforming specific areas that are situated in the ways that they are, but creating newer centers. Because I, as a queer person, would not want, I don't care if there's a reform there. I have no desire to live in a rural setting. So even if you had to reform it, I know by the time you actually deal with me as a queer person, I'm down the line. Because even as we've been speaking here as a general, we've been speaking about women and poor people, but nobody's actually referring to the other anomaly of queer people, as well as the marriage rights or the marriage bill that's just been passed, where women are allowed to marry more than other partners. What does that look like in terms of your reform? What does that look like, you know?
Mpho, I think that the comment made by Bevel and I didn't get your name. Len, I direct you directly to you.
Except the rural land question, no? No, Nelly, I think I'll come share my reflections on Bevel's statements as well. But I think Nelly hit the nail on the head with respect to her framing it in terms of commodification of life. It really is, so what we like to say is to create this sense of panic around shortage and scarcity, shortage of housing, affordable housing crises. But what it comes down to is access to space. And again, we're facing the question around the privatization of those spaces. So it's actually about who's allowed to enter where and who's allowed to enter what. So despite the fact that there are numerous vacant, underutilized, empty lots, like Nelly stated, using those vacant spaces, using those underutilized spaces, is against the interests of those who hold those spaces. So people would rather hold on to empty spaces to speculate, to sell on, etc., to propel this status quo, rather than better use those empty spaces, those underutilized spaces, to accommodate people who actually would use them better and who would use those spaces not only to assert a place to live, but to assert themselves in terms now of society and becoming members of that immediate society. Now, the question around the false sense of hope around urban centers, I think comes down to two things. Firstly, I think it's partly a relic of the migrant system that was generated colonial times and apartheid times. It's the same format that people from outside who are deliberately under-resourced are made to come into these economic centers to give of their labor, usually at a very low price. Now, the effect of that is people who work in the cities can't afford to live in the cities. So that again pushes them outside of the very centers where they need to be for those work purposes. And that's why people occupy in and around city centers and in the peri-urban spaces, because they want that access to those economic centers. They want to be economically active members of society, but the only way that they can do that is to be present in these spaces. So it's a question around how the nation looks at its spatial dynamic and how the nation uses spatial planning and all of those mechanisms in terms of where the economic centers are and how that relates to where people are and how they live. So there hasn't been a real recognition or a real interrogation of that relationship. And there has been no break from the past in terms of how we actually perpetuating what was set up by the migrant labor system. And then I think, last thing, at the very core of that is capitalism. That's just the standard answer for everything. But capitalism is at the very root of that. Because you have to ask yourself, why do people need to be in economic centers? To work. To work for what? So this is the capitalist dynamic that has put us in this position. And now we're stuck in the cycle that we can't seem to see past and see beyond. Even in terms of going back to emakhaya, to realize our self-worth and our self-value as people on that type of land. We would rather live up to the aspirations set upon us by these capitalist notions.
Well, thank you so much, Mpho. Looking at the time, we began at 10:05, and we are slightly behind. But I'd like to thank our panelists. But before we go, any last words from each of you?
I'd rather
Andries.
defer to Andries.
Okay.
He hasn't had a chance.
Yeah.
I'll say one thing. Somewhere in a lot of this bleakness, there's also a very inspiring vision. Tembeka talked about just recognize the reality of customary law on the ground, put people back in charge of the land that they are already on, is what is needed in particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, etc. And a similar vision of people's power, of just create space for people to find the solutions for where they need to live and where they need to be, is implicit in what Difuna Ikwazi is doing. And it seems to me something like that is going to happen anyway. No matter how many red ants you have and how many security cops and so on, people are going to occupy. It can either happen in an unlawful way, as an eruption of desperation. It can happen in a violent way. It can happen in a way which is itself corrupted by gangsterism, warlordism, people exploiting this lawlessness. It can happen in a way that involves the fragmentation of our society and an increasing distance between the spaces of the state and the constitution and the spaces of what people are doing anyway. Or it can happen in a way that is supported by the constitution, because none of these processes of occupation that we've here described them are actually about lawlessness. They're about people seeking the security of tenure that they are guaranteed by the Constitution, seeking the human rights that they are guaranteed by the Constitution. So the question before us is, are we going to open the doors and allow this process of our cities becoming cities, inclusive cities, and cities of the people, our rural areas becoming transformed, where people can simply have the land that they need? Are we going to allow that process to happen in a constructive, lawful, rights-based way, or are we going to allow ourselves to be in a place where we see fragmentation and the increasing real illegitimacy of our Constitution and cynicism about our Constitution? So that, I think, is the choice before us as a country.
Well, time flies when we're having fun, right? Well, we've come to the end of our session. A big round of applause to our panelists. Another big round of applause to you. Thank you for making it. We certainly have a long road ahead with regards to land matters. Please get yourself a copy of this book. Thank you.
Most important.
Thank you.